Okay. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for your goodness, for your love that you have for us, Lord, for this time that you have given us here with your servant. I ask that you please use him, that you please guide him with what he's going to teach us, that the words that come out of his mouth, that those are from you, Lord. And I just ask that you take care of us tonight and that you just be with us right now. And thank you for everything that you do for us, for your son, Lord, that we may remember him, not just right now during Christmas, but every day for the rest of our lives. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
All right, awesome. All right, so today we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5, but let's recap what happened last week. Remember last week, King Nebuchadnezzar praises God. That's how he begins the chapter. But remember that the beginning of the chapter was actually the end of the chapter. It was a letter that he had written. We see that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream regarding the tree. And he calls the wise men to interpret the dream. And obviously, nobody was able to do it, with the exception of Daniel. And we see that the dream was fulfilled, and King Nebuchadnezzar was restored back to normal, and God for it at the end. Now, that pretty much ends Nebuchadnezzar's story in life from there. Now we're going to move on to chapter 5. Chapter 5 is going to be about 30 years after Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to see that. So the word here, it says son, but you know how I always say context will dictate what a meaning is. So the word in Aramaic here, it could mean son. It could also mean a descendant, a predecessor. So looking at the original language, I don't actually think it was his son who was on here. I think it just would have been his predecessor, because the King Belshazzar had a father, and so it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. So it was either used as a descendant from him, or as in monarchs, when somebody passed on the torch, you could say, at that time they would say, "Oh, that was your father." But anyway, so that's what's kind of going on here. So Nebuchadnezzar's out of the picture. This is about 30 years later, and Daniel's this old guy by this time. So from in that time period, it looks like it was pretty chill. Daniel wasn't really being used much, but we're going to see what happens here. All right, Daniel chapter 5, verse 1 says, Belshazzar. So this is not Daniel, because remember, Daniel's Aramaic name was Belteshazzar. I thought it was Daniel at first, but no, Belshazzar. The king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he said to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then he brought gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand came out and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the splendor of the king's face changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees were knocking against each other. The king called out loudly to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners. The king answered and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this writing, declare its interpretation to me, shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck, and rule with power as the third ruler of the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known its interpretation to the king. The king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and the splendor of his face changed further, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen answered and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or the splendor of your face be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, set him as chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners." This was because the extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving off difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you, and that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, extraordinary wisdom has been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me. They might read this writing and make interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretation and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the writing and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will rule with power as the third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts remain with you, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the writings to the king and make its interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted the kingdom, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, men of every tongue feared and were in dread before him. Whomever he wished he killed, whomever he wished he kept alive, and whomever he wished he raised up, and whomever he wished he made low. But when his heart was raised up, and his spirit became so strong that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from the sons of men, and his heart was made like that of a beast, and his place of habitation was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like the cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of the sky until he knew that the Most High God is the powerful ruler over the kingdom of mankind, and that he sets up over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not made your heart lowly, even though you knew all this, but you have raised yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines, have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or know. But the God in whose hand are your life's breath and all your ways you have not honored. Then the hand was sent from him, and his writing was inscribed. Now this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found lacking. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar said the word, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now would be the third powerful ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. All right. Where are we at? Let's start here. Okay. So, all right. First section, verses 1 through 4. So, like I was mentioning, it says son. So this was after Nebuchadnezzar. This was the final king of Babylon, Belshazzar. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar's son was on the throne. This was about 30 years after he died. In the ancient world, successive monarchs were often identified as sons of famous predecessors, even when there was no dynastic or genealogical connection. Ancestor or predecessor may be the right relationship. So I don't think it was actually his son. It was just a name. That's how they would call themselves. Belshazzar was the last Babylonian king. He threw a big feast for about 1,000 of his nobles. There was a lot of heavy drinking going on. So as I looked at the background information, this was actually more of an orgy party. There was a lot of women, a lot of people, a lot of alcohol. So this was common practice back in the days, orgy parties. So that's more like what was going on here. The king ordered the vessels. So back in Daniel 1, which I don't think none of you guys were here, when Babylon took over Judah, they went into the temple in Jerusalem, and they took a lot of gold and silver sacred items, cups, plates, different things, right? He took from them. Everyone and they brought it back to Babylon, and they actually kept it. Everyone in the ancient world understood the significance of sacred vessels. The fact that these had not been melted down suggests that they had been preserved because of their sacred character. Since the god of Babylon was seen as the conqueror, the things that belonged to the conquered gods would have been taken. The temple in Jerusalem, like I said, so it was the stuff that was in the temple of Jerusalem that was holy and sacred to the Jews. That stuff was brought to their orgy party to start drinking. So they got drunk, and they began to praise many different false gods. So it was just a big old sinful party. But let's look at some verses of what God thinks about this type of stuff. Isaiah 42:8 says, I am Yahweh, that is my name. I will not give my glory to another, nor my praise to graven images. Psalm 115:4, their idols are silver and gold, the works of man's hand. Psalm 135:15, the idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. Habakkuk 2:19, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise, and that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath in all of it. One of the purposes of the feast during the Persian invasion. So at this time, Babylon was at war with the Persian Medes, right? So this was around the time when the Persians finally invaded and took over. So it may have been to commemorate Babylon's earlier victories as a way of calling on her gods to defend her now. One way of praising the gods was to pour out drink offerings to them in the temples. So then we see in verses 5-6, a mysterious hand shows up. During their drunken orgy fest, we see that suddenly some fingers of a man's hand appears, and it begins to write on the wall. The king sees this. He sees the back of the hand as he's writing. The king is in shock, and his face turns pale. The king was alarmed at what he was looking at. Though God does not have a body, his actions are often metaphorically described as accomplished by his hand. So when the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, talks about the hand, it talks about the works, which probably shouldn't get into this, but in Revelation, the mark of the beast, when it talks about the forehead and the hands, obviously it's symbolic. It means about what you think about and who you serve. Metaphors, not real. It's not no microchips, not none of that stupid stuff that people think it is. It's understanding the Old Testament, how they used it. The hand was the works, what you did with it, right? So here's a few scriptures that talks about God using his hands. Psalm 37:24. When he falls, he will not be hurled headlong because Yahweh is the one who sustains his hand. Psalm 95:4. In whose hand are the depths of the earth? The peaks of the mountains are his also. Isaiah 5:25. On this account, the anger of Yahweh has burnt against his people, and he has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down. And the mountains trembled, and their corpses lay like a refuse in the middle of the streets. For all that his anger is not turned back, but his hand is still stretched out. So the hand symbolizes work being done. From verses 7-9, we see that the king calls his wise men. Remember, in the previous chapters, he has called his wise men and they failed him so many times. But yet he continues to call them. So he calls the wise men and he promises them, hey, if you guys interpret this correctly, I will reward you. And they failed them since we've been starting to study, every time they have failed them. So what is the meaning of the gifts? The purple clothing was made using expensive dye and was worn only by royalty. Purple was the color of royalty. The gold chain would have been an insignia of office. These were seen as royal gifts. None of the wise men could read and interpret the writing. This was the third time they had failed them. Isaiah 47:13 says, you are wearied with your many counsels. Let now the astrologers, those who behold visions by the stars, those who predict by the new moon, stand up and save you from what will come upon you. Genesis 41:8. Now it happened in the morning, his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh recounted them his dream, but there was no one that could interpret it. So this was seen a lot in the Old Testament. So-called wise men, pagan wise men, who think they could see the future and do all this stuff, they've always failed. And you see a lot of parallels with Daniel and in the story of Joseph in Genesis with the Pharaoh. There's a lot of connection going on. This is very similar. The king and his people are worried. He calls them again. He sees his hand. No one can interpret it. Now he's worried. Reminded me of this passage, Isaiah 13:6-8. Wail, for the day of Yahweh is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore, all hands will fall limp, and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and labor pains will take hold of them. They will rise like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment. Their faces are aflame. So they were just afraid of what was going on. They couldn't understand, what was happening. So then we go on to verses 10-12. So it says the queen, digging deeper. This was not the king's queen. No, this was actually the queen's mother, because she was old enough to have known about Nebuchadnezzar and lived at that time. Remember that he had many wives and concubines, so this was actually one of the queen's mothers. So it wasn't the actual queen. Different translations will actually tell you that it was the queen's mother. This specific one that I'm using, I don't know why it just says queen, but the other translations, it says the queen's mother. So the queen's mother comes, and he tries to comfort him. He reminds Belshazzar about Daniel and what he had done in the past for Nebuchadnezzar. She had to be pretty old to remember all that time period. They looked at Daniel. Remember that the Babylon looked at Daniel, who was back then, anyways. They looked at Daniel, who was someone who was blessed by the gods, according to them, right? who was blessed by the gods with great knowledge and insight, and he was the leader of the wise men at one point. So the king summons Daniel. By this point, Daniel was already old, and he was probably forgotten by the majority of the Babylonians, and he probably wasn't used much after the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But the queen's mother remembered him. In verses 13 to 7, now, okay, Daniel is summoned to speak to the king. The king confirms that this is Daniel, who he had heard about, who had done all these great things for Nebuchadnezzar. The interesting part here is, instead of greeting Daniel as one of the former leaders of the wise men who had prestige, honor, and respect in the times of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar attempts to put Daniel in his place by calling him one of the exiles that my father, the king, brought from Judah. The king was actually being a jerk towards Daniel. King Belshazzar tells Daniel that his wise men could not interpret the writings on the wall and wants Daniel to do it and would reward him. Daniel rejects the rewards, but is still willing to interpret the writing on the wall. Note here that Belshazzar, Daniel noticed Belshazzar's pride and condescension. Daniel refused his reward, but was still willing to help him out in this, during this time. Verses 18 to 21. Now Daniel reminds Belshazzar about the times of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel reminds him that it was God, the God of Israel, who had blessed Nebuchadnezzar's former kingdom. God gave the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar. He also reminded him the mistakes that Nebuchadnezzar made, being prideful, arrogant, and not giving God the credit and honor that he deserved. And because of this, God took away the kingdom from Nebuchadnezzar, punishing him and banishing him by making him act like a wild animal until Nebuchadnezzar realized that it was God alone who ruled all things. Daniel contrasted Belshazzar with Nebuchadnezzar, to whom the Most High God gave kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Nebuchadnezzar was given godlike powers to kill and keep alive, to raise and to humble. Yet, when he became prideful, arrogant, God humbled him and comprehensively until he confessed the power of the one true God. So he tells the king these stories, hoping that it would register in his head, like, hey, bro, you're doing the same thing. Look what happened to him. You're doing the same thing, hoping that he would realize that and maybe change his ways or something, In verses 22 to 23, now Daniel calls out King Belshazzar's sin against God. Daniel calls him out for not being humble, even though the king knew the story of Nebuchadnezzar. They knew the story, but yet this king chose not to learn from the mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar. King Belshazzar also exalted himself against God. And then he gives examples of it. And one of it was a straight disrespect when he brought the vessels from the temple for their drunk orgy party to drink from it. These were sacred items, and he used it for the party that was going, they were doing all kinds of sin was going on, and they used sacred items to get drunk. Also, they were praising other gods. The king had failed to glorify the one true God, just like Nebuchadnezzar. Here's a few scriptures. Isaiah 2:12. For Yahweh of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and high, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be made low. Psalm 115:4-8. Their idols are silver and gold, the works of man's hand. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. They have noses, but they do not smell. As for their hands, they do not feel. As for their feet, they do not walk. They do not make sound with their throat. Those who make them will become like them, and everyone who trusts in them. This is actually a good passage to send to a Roman Catholic. Then we move on to verses 24 to 28. Here we see that Daniel finally interprets the writing done with the hand. So Daniel tells the king that hand was sent by God. And on the wall it was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now this last one, the Upharsin, there's other Bible translations would have it Mene, Mene, Tekel, Perez, or Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Again, translation, I'm just giving you the different ones. Now, if you were to read it like in English, I guess, it would have said number, weighed, and divided. Right? All of us probably like, well, what in the world does that mean? Okay. The mene part, it means to number. God had numbered Belshazzar's kingdom to put an end to it. The tekel meant to weigh something. The king had been weighed on the scales, metaphorically speaking, and found that he was lacking. The Upharsin or Perez or Parsin means divided. The king's kingdom was divided and was going to be handed over to the Medes and Persians. And in the Old Testament, in Isaiah and other parts too, God prophesied that this was going to happen. So in Isaiah 13, 17, and 19 says, Behold, I am going to awaken the Medes against them, who will not think about silver or take pleasure in gold, and their bows will dash the young men to pieces. They will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eyes pity children. And it will be that Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the honor of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So remember, God used Babylon to punish the Jews. But then God goes and punishes Babylon because of their pride and arrogance and failed to honor him for who he really was. So he sends the Medes and Persians to punish Babylon. So a little more information on the Mene Mene thingy. So Daniel read and interpreted the writing Mene Mene Tekel and Perez. Let's say Perez because the words were written in Aramaic in a form of sequence of weights. So how can I explain it? The words have their root in how they used to weigh things, right? They used to call it a mina into a shekel. Again, that's the way they used to weigh things. It was not that the king and the wise men could not read them, but they failed to understand their significance. Again, if one of us just read number and divided or whatever, you like, well, what does that mean? You have no idea what that means. But Daniel was able to read those words and interpret it, what it meant, right? So I think Daniel read them as verbs, which use different vowels attached to the Aramaic language. So the sequence became numbered, weighed, and divided. The Lord had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end because he had weighed in the balance and found that he was lacking. The repetition of the Mene Mene, which means numbered, may suggest that it was going to happen quickly, which it did. As a result, Belshazzar's kingdom would be divided, given to the Medes and Persians. Interesting enough here, the word Perez is the singular of the word Parsin, which sounds very similar for the Aramaic word for Persia. So I don't think that's a coincidence why those words were used. And then we go to verse 29. We see that Daniel was rewarded. Belshazzar kept his promise rewards Daniel for interpreting the writing. He gets the robe, the necklace, and everything, and becomes the third most powerful ruler in Babylon. Once again, we see Daniel's faithfulness is rewarded by God. But how long did that rulership last? Not long, because in verse 30, that same night, as it says in verse 30, that same night, Babylon falls. The king is killed. Jeremiah 51:11 says, sharpen the arrows, fill the quivers. Yahweh has aroused the spirit of the kings of the Medes because of his purpose against Babylon. To what? To destroy it, for it is the vengeance of Yahweh, vengeance for his temple. Jeremiah tells us here that God is punishing Babylon. He's going to bring up the kings of Medes and Persia to destroy it. And he even talks about what was the vengeance. What did the Babylonians take from the temple in Jerusalem? The sacred vessels. So God was going to punish him for that. I mean, there's countless other reasons, but we see here in Jeremiah, he's specifically talking about the vessels that they took to drink in their orgy parties. The Medes and the Persians entered Babylon and killed the king, taking over the Babylonian Empire. Interesting enough, the last official act of the Babylonian Empire, the empire that destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, their last act, they go and honor a Jerusalem exile as prince. This empire, this people who came to just wipe out Jerusalem, the very last thing they ended up doing was honoring somebody from there. And verse 31, we see that the new king takes over, the Persian Mede king. His name was Darius the Medes. He takes over as the king. So let me give you a little background information on this, and this is a straight quote. And it says, his identity, meaning Darius the Mede, his identity remains a mystery. Historical records indicate that Babylon fell to Cyrus, the Persian, in October 539 BC. Cyrus had earlier incorporated the kingdom of the Medes into his empire. Perhaps Darius was a Median ruler who ruled Babylon for a short period of time under the great authority of Cyrus. Perhaps Darius was the man known as Gubaru, the governor of Babylon. Alternatively, Darius could be another name for Cyrus. So there is a little question mark on who this Darius the Mede guy is. There is a Darius from Persia. That guy, they know who he is, but this Darius the Mede, that's where they're not really sure who exactly that guy is. So I just thought it was an interesting quote on who that could have been. All right. Is there any way that we see Jesus directly or indirectly in this chapter? This was a little tougher, but I mean, just a reminder, Jesus is the one and true King of the world. Remember that kingdoms are going to come and fall, but Jesus' kingdom will last forever. And remember that Daniel typifies Jesus. He is a type of Christ. Practical applications. What can we learn from this chapter? Praise belongs to God alone and no one else. That was the problem with Nebuchadnezzar and this king. They wanted all that praise for themselves. They exalted themselves. They were so prideful, so arrogant. God's Spirit can give us power to endure and go through really tough times. God gives out gifts to his people for his purpose and his glory. God is sovereign. He is in control of all things, regardless of how bad it may look, even if it seems like the enemy is winning. And I think this is very applicable for modern day times. Like, we see how crazy the world is, and we just think that the devil's winning and all this stuff, but God is in control. That's why you keep hearing me every week say, you should not live in fear. So what? We have a horrible president. So what? We have all these wars. So what? This is nothing new. This has been happening since biblical times. So this is nothing new. When you're able to remember that God is sovereign, God is in control, God gives and takes away kingdoms, God puts kings and rulers where he wants them and he takes them away, he's in control. And regardless how bad life may look, we win. God's people are going to win. So I see no reason why Christians should be all scared and look at the world and no, man, don't worry about all that. Like I said, you guys heard me talk about that for weeks already. There's no need for fear because we win. God is in control, and when Christ comes, the final two enemies are going to be defeated. So the worst thing that can happen to us is we die. So what? We're going to be resurrected, right? If we're true believers, we're going to get resurrected. So there's really nothing we should fear in this world. And like I said, it may look horrible and what's going on, but we don't know what God's doing behind the scenes. And you already know how the media is. They're going to portray all the bad stuff. But you think God's not working in other parts of the world? There's not people being saved and stuff like that? Of course there is. But do you think the media is going to point that out? No. They don't want to give God the glory. They're just going to they want to put all the hate and put fear into people. And sadly, the media is what has so many Christians afraid now. That and their bad theology on Revelation is why most Christians live in fear. There's no need for that. We win. No need to live in fear. God grants and takes away kingdoms and power to people. God hates pride, hates arrogance, and hates idolatry. And we talk, you always hear, oh, God is love, and yes, but you have to remember, God is a holy, jealous, and angry God who does punish. We see more of that in the Old Testament, but I think people like to make God like some little Santa Claus or a little genie, and they forget that he gets angry. He punishes. Maybe not like how he used to in the Old Testament, but he don't push him either. He'll pull out that rod on you and just really chastise you. So don't take his grace for granted. People know, I think most people, well, actually, they do. Especially if you read Romans, the last part of Romans 1, beginning of Romans 2. No one has an excuse. Everybody knows God because we have a conscience. We're made in his image. That conscience tells us what's right and wrong. And that's why no one has an excuse. Deep down, everyone knows that God exists. In first 2 chapter Romans talks about that. But we harden ourselves to his truth. So we just choose not to. We choose to be disobedient because we want to be God, or we want to make other things our God. We want to be prideful. It's me. We live in a selfish, prideful, me world. And those are the people that, sadly, I see that a lot even with Christians. They call themselves that, and they live that me lifestyle where it's all about them. No time for God. Nothing but excuses for God. But for them, their likes, their wants, they'll make time for that, but not for God. That's the sad part about it. People like Satan, the originator, often try to raise themselves to the status of exaltation or to the same level or higher than God. And we see that a lot of that with people with power. Kings, presidents, people with money, they like to elevate themselves. That's just one of those sins that humans have. They want to do that. But we also have to remember that God rewards his faithful servants. He may not give you a mansion. He might not give you 20 cars. But you have the best gift, and that's salvation, forgiveness of sin, peace, joy, his Holy Spirit. We are those in Christ are spiritually rich. And we need to remember that. We are rich individuals in Christ, and who knows what else he has in store for us in the next age. God, and this is one that I had to learn the hard way for a long time. That in my past I carried a lot of anger, bitterness, and resent towards people, and that is that God will avenge those who oppose His people. I know, relationships with people are tough, and sometimes we're like, man, that's not fair. What about me? And look at them. And trust me, these are conversations I've had with God before. I'm like, whoa, Lord, I'm serving you, and I don't have this, and I'm this, and look at that person over there. They don't even serve you, but they look happy. Why are they getting blessed and stuff like that? But we don't have the right to tell God stuff like that. But we have to remember that everyone will answer to God. God sees all the bad stuff we've done to people and all the bad stuff that's been done to us. And God will avenge His people. And the last one is somewhat controversial. Alcohol, although not necessarily prohibited, abuse can cause lots of problems. Now, there's some Christians who be like, no, it's okay for me to have some drinks and smoke. I don't even know why. While other people are like, no, that's a sin. You're going to hell. No, the Bible does not say that alcohol is a sin. It's a sin to get drunk. But I think, me personally, I wouldn't drink. And me personally, I won't associate with people who drink. Definitely wouldn't date anyone who drinks. Not because it's a sin in and of itself, but it opens the door. You guys already know. I'm sure all of us here has drunk stories of things that we've seen or done, and alcohol generally doesn't end with something good. And so I just say, if you're a believer, why would you run the risk of opening yourself up to possibility? Alcohol, man, once you're tipsy and drunk, that's it. It's easy for you to fall into sin, fornication, car accident, a fight, or whatever. So why risk it? I never had a problem with alcohol. I never had a problem with drugs. So I don't understand the need for it. But I do understand the addiction in other areas. It's not that. So it's probably somewhat related. But I don't know. Like I said, it's one of those things between you and God. If you want to drink in your home, that's on you. I personally don't like to be around it. And I would encourage real believers not to drink. You just run the risk. All it takes is one too many drinks, and you guys already know at parties and stuff, when there's alcohol, there's all kinds of stuff goes on. Questions, comments before we move on to the discussion questions?
No.
No? Okay. Cool. Question number 1. Why do you think we are prone to view ourselves as indestructible or untouchable? How can you see this tendency in your life?
That's all about ego. Pride.
Ego, pride. Anybody else want to add anything? Yeah. No? Okay.
I don't know. I think it's like easy to live in the moment, like it's easy to, it's hard to think past what you're living right now, like this life. So you want to be in control, and yeah, like your ego, I got this, I worked hard for this, and I did this, and this is why I have what I have. And
you see the common word that you're saying is I.
Yeah.
What was the issue that the Nebuchadnezzar was doing? I built this empire. I put in the work. And look what God said. Okay, I'm going to take it from you. I'm not saying you're doing that, but what I'm saying is that's common for us. Sometimes even us, probably once in a while, we'll get into that I thing. But that's what we need to be careful with. That I. It's not I. It's God. God gave me this job. God gave me this. God. Glory for God. God is the one But we just sometimes have this thing where we make it about ourselves, like, oh, we did this. Look at us, which is what was the problem with the kings here. They didn't give God the respect, honor, and glory that he deserved because it was I, me. So we just got to be careful we don't fall into that trap. How does Belshazzar actions serve to mock God in his glory? What are some other ways we implicitly mock God's glory? From what he did, Belshazzar, his taking the sacred vessels, his drunken orgy parties, how did that mock God in his glory?
He didn't have any respect for him. It's almost like he didn't believe that those things were even sacred, and he just, like, it was a joke to him, and he just took all those, sacred things, and then to top it all off, he what he was doing, like the parties and all that.
Yeah. What are some ways in our modern time? What are some ways that what are some things or ways that we do in modern times that mocks God in his glory? Anybody think of something that people do nowadays that you're mocking God in his glory?
Mhm.
Anything that we say, that we do, that we show that mocks God? You can't think of anything?
Oh my God, that's an easy one. When you say,
Yeah,
"Oh my,"
using his name in vain. That's one of it.
Mhm.
I would say, I mean, there's a lot of different things we can say, right? But I think one of the biggest things, I mean, so as an when you see unbelievers, what can you expect? Right? What can you expect in unbelievers? You think they're gonna have respect for God and his laws? No. I think one of the most disrespectful things that could be done to mock God and his glory is to profess to believe in him, to profess to know him, to profess to serve him. Your life does not show that. I think that's one of the biggest insults, to sit there and walk around, Christian hat, Christian, and you live just like everybody else. No respect for his word, no respect for his laws, no respect for nothing. You make his people, you make his church. Why do you think people criticize, make fun of Christians? What's one of the first things you say? Wow, you guys are the biggest hypocrites in the world. It's true. How can you say you represent God, but your life doesn't show that? How can you say you represent God, but he's the last person on your list of things to do or talk to or anything that has to do with him? How can you say you serve God when you know you're in sin, don't even repent, don't even care? You know that you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, and you continue to do it anyways. and call yourself a Christian. How we live. How we live is says a lot. How we live is why people have certain views about Christians or God or the Christian faith, religion, what you want to call it. They attack the people. You call yourself a Christian, or you do this. So that's something, and I know you guys hear me talk a lot. I know it seems like I pick on Christians a lot, but it's just too many fakes out there. Too many people claim to represent, and they don't represent them right. And that's why our churches are the way they are. So I think that's something we should all look at ourselves in the mirror and say, is there anything that I'm doing that's not very Christ-like? Is there anything that I'm doing that dishonors God and his glory that I need to stop? Is there a sin that I'm doing that I know is wrong, but I choose not to stop? There's a problem. Let me read something from Romans 12. Then, therefore, I exhort you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, living, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may approve what the will of God is, that which is good and pleasing and perfect. So this part right here, present your bodies as a sacrifice, living, holy, and pleasing to God. How many people call themselves Christian and they fail miserably here? How we worship God, how we please God, how we present our bodies, what we do with our lives, how we talk, how we live, how we think, all of that. That's what he's talking about right here. Don't be conformed to the world. What does the world approve of? Anything that's anti-Christ. Whatever the world says it's okay, whatever the world is good with, more than likely it's probably unbiblical. We must live lives that are approved to the will of God by renewing our minds. Spiritual service of worship, how we present our bodies. In a nutshell, how we live. Time here. Here's a dumb question. How and why does sin make us foolish? Okay, I can give you an example from my life. When I was heavily in sin, I always felt God calling me. I always felt him pulling on me, telling me to go back to church. How did my sin make me foolish? When I believed the lie that God would never forgive me. Where I believed the lie of how can you go to church? Look what you just did last night. You cheated on your wife. Now you want to go to church? What kind of hypocrite are you? God ain't gonna save you. God ain't gonna protect you. God ain't gonna forgive you. Stuff like that. That's how my sin made me foolish. For many, many years, I ran away from God knowing deep in my heart that I needed to stop. But I was so deep in sin that I believed the lie that God could never forgive me. That I was a hypocrite if I wanted to go back to church. Okay, here's another one. How are God's acts of discipline also acts of grace?
When he
Yep.
doesn't let you have something that you want, because he knows that that's not what you need, you're gonna get, if he allows that to happen, then it's gonna get you into more trouble. More than you already are, probably.
Yeah. Especially those of us who have kids, right? Sometimes we have to discipline them for their own good because we love them. But why wouldn't God discipline us if he loves us? Although I'm sure none of us here want to be disciplined by God, but be thankful when he does, because that's like showing you that he cares and he still loves you. Because he wants you to stop whatever dumb stuff you're doing and get back on track. And then some of us, like me, I generally tend to be more hard-headed and stubborn. Sometimes I need I need that rod pulled out on me a few times. It's tougher for me to get things going because I tend to be stubborn. Not as bad now, but especially before I really was. So how does that how does that how does special fun? Show Jesus. Yeah, okay, that's it. Any final things? Any last things before we end it?
No, I think we're good.
Good. All righty. All right, ladies. Hope you guys can show up for Thursday. We'll be in the Gospel of Mark. Have a good night.
Bye.
Night, everyone.